Okay, welcome to pharmacology. We're going to start with chapter 1, talking about some basic overview of pharmacology and regulation and approval. We'll run through the NCLEX questions and explain why those are the case. First one is, client tells the nurse, I've been reading about research trials and would like to be involved in one. The nurse asks the client if she has any documented diseases, knowing that the client might be eligible to participate in which clinical trial. If you look at the definition of phase 2, that includes testing clinical trials that actually test people with the known disease that that drug is going to be used for. So that would be the AMP3 phase 2. Phase 1, on the other hand, is going to be just done on general healthy people and not so specific. So that should be your kind of differential there. Next question is, a client who plans to purchase drugs from Canada expresses concern that the drugs will be substandard. The nurse explains, and what you're going to think about, the answer choices are you should have reservations about obtaining drugs from Canada. Drugs from Canada must comply with standards established by recognized formularies in the United States and are safe. The Canadian Food and Drug Act has a much different approval process and is not as stringent as ours in the United States. And 4, I can understand you want to save money, but it would be better to purchase your drugs in the United States. There is actually that drugs from Canada, they follow a very similar approval process. There's some differences in step numbers and that type of thing, but in general, it is as stringent, so they are considered safe, and that should be something that we can pass on to our. Question 3, a client prefers to purchase over-the-counter meds rather than the prescription meds whenever possible. And the nurse informs the client that advantages to using over-the-counter meds include, number 1, they're less expensive than prescriptive medications. 2, fewer side effects can be expected. 3, access to them is easier. And 4, they do not interact with food and beverages. Clearly, access to them is easier because we know that they can indeed be expensive. They don't necessarily have any fewer side effects than prescriptive drugs, and they are very well known to interact with food and beverages, so we can't say that that's the case either. However, access to them is very easy. Question 4, the nurse explains to a client that the phase post-marketing surveillance is best described as 1, the trial and animal drug testing. 2, the longest part of the approval process. 3, the final stage of the approval process. And 4, extensive laboratory research. The answer is post-marketing is the final stage. So after it goes through the clinical trials, that post-marketing period is a pretty extensive time. The actual time frame that is involved in getting a drug approved is around about 11 years, which is pretty lengthy when you look at all those. Each one of those steps takes several years to complete. Question 5, the nurse explains to a client that during the FDA drug approval process, clinical investigators from many different medical specialties address concerns as, number 1, whether the drug is effective. 2, whether a new drug application must be filed. 3, placing the application for review for 6 months. And 4, determining the marketability of the drug. As they include specially wanting to know is whether the drug is effective by all those different specialists. So that is the answer. The others are not in that step of the process, so they would be ruled out. Question 6, a client asked the nurse, I read that the pill I am taking is a biologic. Is this some kind of a special drug? The nurse explanation is based on the knowledge that Number one, biologics include medications as well as all types of complementary alternative therapies. 2 are strictly derived from natural plant products. 3 are drugs that are similar to natural products but are artificially created in a laboratory. And 4 are agents produced by animal microorganisms or the human body. And the 4 because they aren't really complementary alternative therapies, so you can rule out number 1. They aren't derived from plant products. They are biologics, so they are from animal products. And they aren't created in a laboratory artificially. That's part of the reason they're called biologics, because they're naturally produced. Question 7, a healthy young client informs the nurse that she is enrolled in a clinical nurse research study. The nurse recognizes the client is involved in which phase of the trials. And again, if you look at the definition of your clinical trials are, number 1, preclinical investigation, number 2, clinical investigation, 3, review of the new drug application, and 4, post-marketing survey. She's actually participating in the clinical investigation portion of that. So, question number 10, the nurse can check the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, and I can't say that very well, national formulary to find out which information about a drug that a client is receiving. By definition, that is basically about number 1, but our choices are exact ingredients and strength of purity. Number 2, common side effects. 3, reports of death attributed to the drug's use. And 4, off-label uses for the drug. It's about the ingredients, so it's sort of like a recipe, if you will. History of pharmacology. We know that, honestly, pharmacology has been around pretty much as long as man. They've been using anything from plants, herbs, and other types of chemical products way back as long as it's been documented in history. So it's been around for a long, long time. Pharmacology is the study of pharmaceuticals, and those can be any number of things. Pharmacology is actually derived from 2 words. One, the first part of it, which means medicine, and logos, which means study. So again, it's about the study of medicines. It's pretty expansive. It uses everything from anatomy and physiology, chemistry, microbiology, and pathophys. We've got some history here as far back as 1693, which was the first reference to pharmacology, and this is just basic historical. And then in the 1800s, they started really deriving and isolating stuff and used some studies on animals. And a lot of times researchers were their own guinea pigs, tried to do that. First Department of Pharmacology established in Estonia, which is over in the European continent, in 1847. And as far as Americans, we've got John Jacob Abel, who started it here at the University of Michigan. When we look at it in common everyday terms, we look at how pharmacotherapy, or the application of drugs for just preventing disease and treatment of suffering, is used. More than 10,000 drugs are currently out there, generic drugs, combination drugs, all different types of therapeutic actions, interactions, side effects, and mechanisms. Almost everything will produce more than one effect on the body. And if we use them properly, we know that they do improve the quality of life. It can be very devastating if they're used improperly, abused, if you will. things like obviously narcotic abuse, but even something as simple as Tylenol, when we look at how people think that that's a fairly benign kind of drug, and if it's taken in excess of 4 grams in a day, can induce liver failure. So it can be pretty darn serious. Again, here's your definitions as far as from the Greek: how drugs are administered, where they go in the body, how they are processed in the body and eliminated in the body, and the responses that use. And we're going to look at all those different categories of pharmacology and how that happens. It is challenging, the virtual vast amount of drugs that are out there. We know that a lot of drugs have been actually, a lot of the drug testing has been done on male subjects, 175 pound on average, and so we do see that they have different effects depending on what a person's age and sex and body mass, health status, and genetics. One of those, for example, I'll give you an example. Lisinopril was actually one of the first drugs out there used for blood pressure. It's one of the first line drugs for blood pressure, and it was tested on men, and ironically had very little side effects. However, what we have found is that over the years, as it's been prescribed to females, a huge percentage will develop a cough, and a real naggy cough, like tickly cough, that is kind of a spastic one. And sometimes that'll go away after a couple of weeks, and other times it does not. About half of the time, if a female starts having that side effect, it will go away on its own, and the other half will not. So that's a perfect example of how sex has a very different effect on folks. We also see age being a big issue. When you look at age factors, we know that very, very young have very immature liver and kidneys versus our very old individuals who's on the other end of the life cycle, who don't have quite the quality of kidney and liver function. And so their ability to process is very different. Likewise, body mass is going to be a factor. What affects a 100-pound person versus a 300-pound person is very different. You all have heard my commercial about how I believe that drugs really should be prescribed much like pediatrics are, in a milligram per kilogram basis, just because of that fact, because adults clearly have a wide range of normal. Health status as well, again, dependent on how well things are absorbed. If it's taken, for example, orally, it's going to make a difference in how well that person's going to respond to that drug, absorption-wise, how effectively their system metabolizes the medication, and again, rids it from the body, excretes it from the body via the liver and kidneys. Genetics as well can make a difference. We'll see things like malaria drugs, which are going to affect certain ethnic groups in a more prominent way. So you have to take all those factors into account. Why is knowledge of pharmacology important to us as nurses? Clearly, we need to know a lot about drugs and how they work. They're one of our major interventions we're responsible for. We often are the one responsible for the administration, most often, in all reality, for giving those drugs and understanding their therapeutic effect and side effects. We need to monitor for what we call therapeutic effect. Is that drug working the way it's supposed to work? Likewise, is there any side effects that may not be a positive one that we need to account for? It isn't an easy subject. We've talked about how difficult it is, but it's one that definitely is important to what we do as far as some discussion of why therapeutics is important. It's a branch of medicine basically concerned with the prevention of disease and treatment of suffering, and pharmacotherapy is going to be very similar to that and basically ride right alongside of that. Pharmacotherapy is about the application of drugs for the purpose of disease prevention and the treatment of suffering, and certainly we use that a great deal. We can see many applications from vaccines to treatment of high blood pressure, treatment of suffering, maybe neoplastic drugs for cancer treatment and that type of thing. So lots of places we see these tools available to us. As oftentimes they're synthesized in a laboratory. Again, if it's a biologic, can't say that. If it's a biologic drug, these agents are produced in animal cells, microorganisms, the body themselves, and used to treat illnesses. But oftentimes we see synthetic types of drugs that are used, that are produced in a laboratory. Once a drug is actually given to a person or a patient, it's considered a medication. So again, biologics are agents that are just that, produced in a biologic kind of being, and so that should be an easy way for you to read. Examples would be hormones, estrogens, that kind of thing. Monoclonal antibodies are actually used in a immunosuppressant kind of situation. So for like transplants or autoimmune diseases like Crohn's disease, where the body kind of acts on itself. So these would be examples of those type of drugs, which are biologics. Natural blood products and components, things like RhoGAM would be a natural blood product. Interferon is actually used, you often see it. Interferons are going to be used basically slowing down viral kinds of infections. You'll see it used with, for example, hepatitis C is not an unusual place that you'll see it. Basically, they're used to slow down. They have antiviral and anti-cancer and anti-inflammatory processes. The other thing of biologics or examples are vaccines, and those range everywhere in the ones you had to get for class to other ones that people get to go travel overseas. So there's any host of those. What complementary and alternative therapies oftentimes are not necessarily fully appreciated, because in all reality what's happened with those is they have become explosive almost in what they're able to do. So as we're doing our history for our patients, we absolutely have to know all these different things that people might be taking. If you ever listened to Barb Bancroft talked about these types of things, they had a situation where they had these young boys that were taking a tea that their grandmother was giving, but this wasn't coming up. Anyway, the long story short here was they were having some breast production and enlargement, and they couldn't figure out why this was happening. And the reality was this tea that the grandmother was giving them actually had some estrogen properties to it. So they were having this breast growth as a result of that. And so while everybody was racking their brain about why these kids were having all these issues, it really boiled down to grandma and the fact that grandma was giving her teas. So we have to know all the different things that our patients take, whether it's something that they just consider a natural supplement or whatever, so that that can be appreciated, and we can look at the side effects and how it interacts with our drugs. Acupuncture, hypnosis, biofeedback, and massage all have been considered alternative therapies for years that have a lot of benefit. We see hypnosis and acupuncture used quite a bit in the control of weight control, hypnosis, pain control, all kinds of things. So there's some real validity to it being, especially as an adjunct, meaning it's used in conjunction with other more traditional therapies. So something to absolutely take into it as far as augmenting what we are already using. Prescription drugs and over-the-counter drugs, it's important that we differentiate between those, and that seems like a real obvious, but what are our advantages and disadvantages to each of those? And obviously a prescriptive drug is one that has to have a physician or a advanced practice nurse write a prescription for in order to gain it. So there is some regulatory process as far as the dosages and quantity of medication that's used versus over-the-counter drugs. Over-the-counter drugs, again, a lot of times people think are very benign and don't have a real issue, and that isn't really a fair statement, because there's some over-the-counter drugs that have been very much abused and even toxic levels. So it's important that we don't discount those as being not a big deal. Over-the-counter drugs obviously don't need a physician's order, and they can treat themselves, but whether they do that well is a whole nother thing. The good news is they don't need an appointment to get those. The bad news is they also don't get the teaching that goes along with that. And over-the-counter drugs can very much interact with foods, herbal products, prescription, or other over-the-counter drugs. And in fact, a lot of times what we're hearing a lot lately about the whole Tylenol thing is that there's Tylenol included in so many medications that patients are kind of accidentally overdosing themselves because they don't appreciate that so many drugs have Tylenol or acetaminophen in them. Again, we see advantages and disadvantages to them. They can be less expensive as far as drugs go, but now with some of our $4 prescriptive drugs, that isn't always the case. The other thing is for those who have insurance, it may be actually cheaper for them to have a prescription called in than to have to go buy it over the counter because their insurance may cover a greater percentage of that. So it may be to their advantage to actually have a medication prescription. Okay, historically, prior to the 19th century, there really wasn't much around, and we saw things that were just developed that really were more of a harm to the public and dangerous, and things that were very addictive, like there was cocaine even legally in certain things, laudanum, and things that were very, very addictive that were put in just an over-the-counter type of way, and again, it was very dangerous to the I'm going to let you read through these, or honestly, this is just pretty basic stuff as far as references and how that came to be and what basically was included in the information there. Again, it was pretty much a list of ingredients for drugs were. And that started on very early, again, in the thoughts that it would protect the public. Pharmacists started coming on board, and combination of groups to basically, again, to put out publications that provided information for pharmacists and individuals. The physician's desk reference, a lot of you have heard of the PDR, and that has been out for some time, and is just a good reference to physicians when they're learning how to prescribe or figuring out what they need to prescribe, and it's updated. Now we see drug books that are updated every year, or at least every 2 years, with a supplement in between. Drugs started having some legislation. You need to look back at what these legislations were and what they basically entailed. Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act came about. Basically, it was the early part of the Food and Drug regulatory process that is still in place today. It made mandated, we started to see mandated issues when it came to labels. You've been looking at this as you've been doing your med calculations. You see on a label the generic name, which is the name in the middle, and then you see the trade names also included on the label. It also tells you the strength of the medication and how it's dispensed. For example, this label tells you that each capsule has 7.5 milligrams. So as you're doing your calculations, as you have already been doing, that tells you how strong each one. And clearly we see drugs that are issued in many different dosages and different ways. So you have to verify which one you're working with. Food and Drug Administration finally came about in my lifetime, 1988, really officially, and it is basically in place, again, in the interest of public safety, to make sure that the testing happens that is necessary for the safety of medications. It includes the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research to look at the safety and efficacy of a drug and make sure that it's going to be, again, safe for the public. Center for Biologic Evaluations and Research, again, another branch, looks at serums and blood products. The reporting happens to this group so that if there is adverse effects that happen as a result of a vaccine, for example, back in the 80s when the DTP really created some very serious side effects, such as neurologic really damage, and there were kids that were basically in a vegetative state after having that vaccine. This would have been where that would have been reported to. This last branch is about herbal and dietary supplements. It's not quite as regulated as closely and strictly as some of the others. It's going to be talked about later, so this is just an overview. When we talk about approval status, we talked about this in some of the questions early on. 4 different stages that you need to understand as far as how things and drugs are tested. Preclinical investigation, they're actually going to test it on human and microbial cells in the lab. They're going to use different species of animals like rats and things like that to look at how effective the drug is, at what dose and what kind of adverse effects are going to happen. It's really the preliminary stuff before they're going to use it on humans. And it often is not very conclusive about what can actually happen. We hear some bad stuff about animal testing, but the bottom line is this is a necessary part of how drugs are tested, so it needs to happen. The second stage is the clinical investigation, and that's going to be in a subcategory. It's going to have 3 different stages of clinical phase trial, and they're basically going to perform tests originally. This takes the longest, by the way, but they're going to test originally on healthy people to see what the proper dosage is, and again, look at adverse effects. They're going to look at really big groups of people and give them that medication and what kind of side effects. See how it interacts with other meds, and if it affects people of different ages, ethnicities, etc. differently. This part is super important because of the huge variability that you're going to see within patients, and again, age groups, sex, body type, and all that kind of thing. As they do the clinical investigation, this can be actually accelerated if they aren't seeing any adverse effects, but on the other hand, if they are starting to see some, it can delay the process. I think this is often a phase that we hear about. They try and hurry up because, for example, for cancer type drugs, the concern is that you have people that are needing that drug, and so they want to go ahead and get it on the market as quickly as possible. The reality is this stage is very lengthy, so it can take a great deal of time for it. The next portion is the new drug application. It has to be submitted for phase 1 clinical trials to determine if there's really big benefits, and at this point, usually you start to see the brand names start to come forward. Once this new drug application is made, the FDA basically can take up to 6 months to approve it and push that drug then to the next part of the process. Post-marketing surveillance is that final stage after the review has happened, and basically to survey for harmful drug effects and side effects and therapeutic effects in a much bigger population. They're going to look at it basically they're going to do surveillance basically of that big population as it starts to be given to patients in a larger study. And at this point, it can be because of feedback that these drugs end up not progressing any further. There may be enough negative feedback on adverse effects that then that drug ends up being removed from the market. Your book talks about several drugs that basically ended up that happening to, and then those drugs are pulled from the market and no longer available. Even though they may be therapeutic for some folks, the risk of the adverse effects outweighs the rest of the benefit. The next slide is basically looking at, again, that process that happens, and I'm going to let you read about the Critical Path Initiative. It just basically talked about, again, another piece of historical thing. Not for you to take in. Clinical investigation, again, talks about the 3 different stages in the clinical phase trials. This takes a long time, looks at human benefits, looking at healthy benefits, and then the target ailment. So, for example, diabetes or high blood pressure. Again, the review of that drug application, average time is 17 to 24 months. Your book talks about they have at least 6 months to just initially review it, and then for the whole process to really do that full review is 17 to 24. If it's rejected, then basically that process is suspended. I think one thing that we have to really consider is how much money is being spent in the process of all this approval process. And it really does cost basically millions of dollars for that to happen. Those costs are often passed on to the individual in the cost of the drug. As long as they're able to not produce a generic, a company can basically hold the rights to a medication for many years, and then their attempt is to regain some of those monies that they're spending on the research. There is a lot of pressure by folks who have these ailments that are particularly lethal that this and basically the application process happen more quickly, and so there's often pressure on the market or even participate in that new or in some of those clinical trials so that they can get the benefit for that. Post-marketing surveillance, again, is about looking at the big population. It's placed on the market. They continue to do a lot of research and get feedback on that medication for some time. If it continues to show promise and be effective, then it remains. And if it becomes basically not ineffective, but if it has significant harmful effects, it may then be pulled from the It again takes about 11 years for a drug to make it all the way through that process, which is pretty. There's been, again, pressure for that to happen more quickly, but the reality is that that process is in place in order to make it more a safer environment for the public. The FDA has done some significant things over the last 20 years to basically speed up that process, and part of that is updating the guidelines. They hired a significant amount of additional staff in order to process the applications more effectively and basically modernize the agency. They added about 700 additional employees toward the end of the 90s, and basically to help, again, process those applications, and started charging user fees, which brought in money that then again also enabled them to better move things through in a more timely. That user fee, your book talks about generating about $300 million in fees, so that's insignificant when you look at money. And what's really happened from that is a lot of positive results. These other acts just went on to basically further reinforce that and add more money and resources for the agency to process drug applications. I'll let you read through the research as far as how much it is helped. We see basically fatal drugs being pulled off the market. Nurses are giving a lot of this feedback and again making it safer. As far as the Canadian process, it isn't all that different than our process. The two are actually fairly similar, and they go through the same steps as far as the ultimate goal is to protect the public and to have safe and effective information. There is a 6-step process in Canada. I think what's really important that you understand is that both of the systems operate very similarly, and they recognize that looking at the big picture is important not just looking at drugs that are synthesized in the laboratory, but also those that come about as far as natural products and supplements and herbs and anything those our patients may end up taking. Here again is the 6-step process in Canada, just so you can see how that comes about, this table in your book. But again, it is very similar. I think the bottom line in this chapter is that you have to recognize that nurses are a huge piece of the process when it comes to pharmacology and the delivery of medications. Ultimately, we are the most responsible when it comes to that drug being issued. We've always talked about how the nurse is really ultimately responsible for any drug that they would give. When we consider about 50% of Americans take some kind of prescriptive drug, it is very important that they have good and accurate information and teaching. We have to make sure they understand all that information, that they're taking drugs for the right reasons, and that they understand how they can interact with one another.